My name's Adam Bennett. I manage the public programs here at the Blanton. It is a thrill for me to be introducing Glenn O'Brien. He's a man who wears many hats, and he's literally written books about how to wear hats. This is my personal dog-eared copy of his book, How to Be a Man. It's a book that certainly lives up to that title. It's the only book that I've ever seen that has blurbs by Kate Moss, Jim Jarmusch, Richard Prince, and Cincinnati Reds first baseman Joey Votto. It distills several centuries of wisdom from Beau Brummel to Baudelaire to Buster Keaton to Bob Marley. Glenn asks to be introduced with Spartan language, Glenn O'Brien, writer. And he's a rightly renowned writer. His bylines range from the New York Times to Vogue to Artforum. He's written essays about the leading names in contemporary art, including Tom Sachs, Shepard Fairey, John Baldessari. He's written music reviews for Rolling Stone and Spin. He wrote a fashion column for GQ, The Style Guy. He was The Style Guy for 17 years. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that an entire generation of American men literally turned to Glenn every month as we shaped our own sense of personal style. He's written for the Whitney Museum, for the Library of America, and his forthcoming book, I believe, is one of the only subjects he hasn't already written about. The book is Past the Henny, A Global History of Cognac. Beyond his writing, he created and hosted the legendary New York Public Access show TV Party from 1978 to 1982, which featured everyone from Robert Mapplethorpe to Iggy Pop, from Kraftwerk to The Clash to Jean-Michel Basquiat. It's a show that David Letterman called the greatest TV show ever, and was also called Anarchy Howdy Doody Guerrilla TV by George Clinton. Now, we've invited him here tonight to talk about print culture in the age of Andy Warhol. Glenn's first boss was Andy Warhol, whom he met while Glenn was writing film reviews for the Village Voice straight out of college. Andy hired Glenn to work on his magazine Interview, where Glenn served as editor and art director from 1971 to 74, then later returned as the music critic during the punk era, writing the column Glenn O'Brien's Beat for another 12 years. And we even have some of these vintage interview issues that you can read inside our exhibition, Warhol by the Book. And Glenn was there this afternoon. He said, "Oh, you should have just asked me. I could have brought down extra copies in my suitcase." The exhibition presents Andy Warhol's work in books. Everything from illustrations for cookbooks to his screen tests with John Ashbery and Allen Ginsberg, to his depictions of Goethe and characters from Hans Christian Andersen, from all stages of Warhol's career, from the 1950s until his death in 1987. And it's fascinating to think about the links between Glenn's work and Andy's work, not only in their collaboration together, but in that each shared interests in a wide range of media, from literature to film to music to fashion. And so this is by no means an exhaustive list of Glenn's accomplishments. I haven't mentioned his screenplays or his current TV series Tea at the Beatrice, his stand-up comedy, his work as a creative director for Calvin Klein, Nike, Rock the Vote, and many more. A lot of you know Glenn's work even when he's not been widely credited for it. He wrote the script for Brad Pitt's Chanel No. 5 commercial. He's the editor for Madonna's book Sex, and he's actually the underwear model on the iconic album art for the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers, which was designed by Warhol. And he Instagrammed it this afternoon. There are so many more famous names he's worked with that we could list, but what's always been important to me personally about Glenn's writing is that there's this wickedly dry wit that's fused with thoughtful reflections on ethics and manners and the social contract. And in Glenn's writing, we're being persuaded about aesthetics and about looking nice, but also about how to be empathetic and how to be nice and how to make the world more humane. Glenn writes in the tradition of the great satirists who mocked the manners and customs of the day, but did so not only for a joke, but to provoke us into being a fairer society. And that's what's really terrific. What's really terrific about so much of Glenn's writing is how he provokes you to think about ethics while he's writing about fashion, music, and art. He'll be speaking for around an hour. We'll have a short question and answer period to follow. We'll also field questions using the Twitter hashtag #AskBlanton, or just raise your hand and we'll get to as many as we can. With that, please join me in welcoming to the Blanton, Glenn O'Brien.
Thank you. Wow, that was so flattering. It's a great honor for you to see me. First of all, I'd like to correct some things, some misunderstandings, and after that you can leave if you want. But I wasn't actually the first editor of Interview. I think I was about 7, because everybody else got fired after they did one issue. Andy, people would ask him, why did you start a magazine? Why did you start Interview? And he would say, to give the kids something to do. And that was partially true, I guess, but then they got fired too. Other people say, oh no, he wanted free tickets for the New York Film Festival, which is probably more likely to be the case. I went to Interview, actually my first job in New York was painting needlepoint canvases at Nina Needlepoint. And my friend Bob Colacello was also there. We were film students at Columbia University School of the Arts. And we were both like really big Warhol fans. And we both went directly from Nina Needlepoint to Andy Warhol's factory, or whatever it's called. Bob was the editor before me. Well, first of all, there was Gerard Malanga, who was the guy who silkscreened the Brillo boxes and the Campbell soup cans. And then there was Terry Ork, who was the manager of the band Television and a career criminal. There was Soren Ingenue, I don't think that was his real name, also career criminal. And who else? There was Don Lyons, who later became the film critic of the Daily News. And he was a very educated guy from Boston who was best friends with Edie Sedgwick and that lot. So I think, presuming Andy wanted to do Interview as a way to get free tickets for the film festival, it was also a good opportunity for him to promote himself. And that was really his great art. I mean, he was, the great artist of our time, but he was really good at publicity. And I think he was sort of following in the footsteps of Salvador Dali, who was also a window dresser like Andy. So when I think about Interview, first of all, it started in '69, which was the year the compact cassette was invented, or went on the market, invented by Philips Electronics. And I think that's really significant because what Interview did, well, the first few issues of Interview didn't really have any interviews in them. And so when Bob and I took it over in 1970, we thought, maybe we should put interviews in Interview. So that's what we did. We made it basically all interviews, except we had a couple of columns. Bob had a column called Out, which was about the rich people that he was trying to get money from to... Bob wanted to be Fred Hughes and sell paintings and get a big commission. He also wanted to be Andy's biographer. He wanted to be Boswell to Andy's Dr. Johnson. And And so that's how I became the editor. Bob was off like, with the jet set, and I was, back home with the X-Acto knife, putting out the magazine. Where was I? Anyway, so we made it all interviews, and it was essentially a lot of movie people, but also we sort of integrated it and started interviewing artists and writers and all kinds of people. We once, who was it? Les Levine, who was a great artist who is now forgotten. Anybody know who Les Levine is? Les Levine was a pop artist, and he interviewed the deputy mayor of Halifax, Nova Scotia for an interview. I think that was one of our greatest interviews. So I did that for about 4 years, and I learned everything. I mean, I learned way more working for Andy than I learned in college. He was like a one-man university. And the main thing was that he taught me how to work. And one of the things was never say no to money. So if they don't offer you enough money, then do it cheaper. And that still serves me well today. I also learned that you're always working. I was at a party, and Andy would take us out to parties at night, and we were out one night at this, fabulous party with all the beautiful people, and Andy turned to me and he said, "This is such hard work." And I thought, wait, we're at a party. These are fantastic people, but I came to realize that parties are hard work too. People think Andy Warhol was an illiterate. Paul Morrissey's still going around telling people that. He's a functional illiterate. He's got Asperger's syndrome. He never created anything. He only copied people. But Andy was kind of the first, he was a copycat. And but he did it really, really well. I mean, he thought, well, Campbell's soup, fantastic. How can you make a better painting than that? Dollar Bill, that was a big hit. People still like it today. So one of the things that I was intrigued by when I first had a chance to go through the archives at the Warhol Museum was how many books Andy had, because if he was on television, he basically answered the interviewer with like, "Oh yeah, maybe, I don't know, yeah." That was kind of his repertoire. But he was quite literate, and in a very arty way. If you look at this exhibit, you'll see there's lots of New Directions books and really distinguished authors. Andy's big crush in life was Truman Capote, and Andy used to call Truman every day, and his mother would answer the phone and say, "Andy Warhol, don't call here anymore." And then years passed. I think Truman's mother passed too. And Andy said, "Oh, Truman, how come you never you wouldn't talk to me?" And Truman said, "Well, you weren't famous." So at that point, they became best friends. And somebody told me today that actually there's a rumor going around that they invented phone sex, which would explain a lot of the conversations I was witness to at the office. Oh, yeah. There was also a big stash of porn in Andy's archives. And unlike lesser institutions, it's all there preserved for the public. When the public is ready to know, I think. Andy was friends with, well, the art world in those days was completely different from the way it is today. Everybody mixed with everybody. Everybody went to Max's Kansas City every night, and you would see Rauschenberg, John Chamberlain, all the big artists. You would see all the big fashion designers, rock stars. I was with Andy there once, and the Jefferson Airplane was there, and he said, "Watch your drink, they're going to put LSD in it." But it was like a really, cauldron of intellectual exchange and, sexual exchange too. But that was what makes the art world of then completely different from the art world today, which is basically, making commodities that one can speculate on without any government regulation. Andy loved money, but even more than money, he liked recognition, and he loved art. And for him, that was everything from dance to poetry, even though he later made fun of poetry, I think because of Gerard Malanga, who was Andy's painting assistant and was, known as one of the most sexually available people on the poetry scene. Gerard was a very handsome guy, leather jacket, really always trying to pick up your girlfriend or wife. So he did many poetry covers, books, magazines, and I could see when he wanted to. I think Interview basically was inspired by Rolling Stone because it was cheap to produce. Originally it was what was called a quarterfold, which is like a tabloid newspaper folded again, and it would fit in the same space on the newsstand as a regular magazine like Time or Newsweek, but it was really cheap to produce, and Rolling Stone was making a lot of money. So I think were encouraged to try and get some of the advertising that they had because it was the same format. And Jan Wenner was in love with Interview, and he tried to buy into it. When Andy wouldn't sell, he tried to buy me. That didn't work out. There was no such thing as same-sex sexual discrimination suits in those days. But then Rolling Stone really upped their interview game. At the time, interviews just were not a part of magazines. They were there was only the Playboy interview and then later the Rolling Stone interview. And I remember the maddest I think I ever got was when Andy interviewed Truman for Rolling Stone. And I said, that should have been ours. How could you do that? And so he agreed to do an interview in every issue after that. There was an Andy Warhol interview with somebody, usually somebody incredible like Liberace. But the interviews that Andy did changed the nature of the interview. It wasn't like the Playboy interview, which was conducted by a serious journalist over like 5 or 6 days, intensely edited and combined. Our interviews by Andy were done maybe in an hour, 2 hours. Usually there was some food involved. some cute people to sit around and decorate the room. And they were, I wouldn't say they were unedited, but they were, all the fly on the wall stuff was left in. The talk with the waiter, the asides, the gossip, it was all, I find myself doing this. I can't watch Donald Trump anymore. But it was realistic, and it was basically realistic in the same way that Andy's movies were realistic. It wasn't like people acting, it was people being who they were. And I think that that's one of the great things that will someday be recognized about Interview, was that it had this, it was a fly on the best wall, you could find anywhere. Andy loved books. I think he realized that he was not qualified to actually write a novel. But Barney Rossett from Grove Press was up at the factory one day, and he said, "Andy, you should really do a novel." And he was like, "Oh, I couldn't do that. That's too hard." And he said, "Well, you use a tape recorder for everything. Just tape it." I said, "Oh, what a good idea." So thus, we got a novel. And the tape recorder was it was a cassette, like really, really old school. It looked like something that was designed to kill rats. And he gave it to Ondine, who was one of the, probably the most outspoken or amphetamine tolerant of the superstars, and it followed him, for like theoretically 24 hours. So it was Andy's version of James Joyce's Ulysses, if you will, and it was a hit. That's I don't buy stocks. I buy first editions of a novel. And it has all the great typing mistakes that are done by the team of girls that were his transcribers. And also there's a lot of pseudonyms, which it's fun to try and figure out who's who and who's talking. One of the transcribers of A is Pat Hackett, and Pat started off as a Velvet Underground groupie. And if you saw Pat Hackett, she really looks like, the receptionist in a knitting mill. But Pat was a perfectly discreet, proper, just right on hard worker. And so she was there every day. She came in and called up Andy to get him out of bed. He was a late sleeper because he went out every night. And in 1972, during a presidential election, Andy made a silkscreen series of depicting Richard Nixon with the caption, "Vote McGovern." It was really, really good. I mean, Nixon was a perfect subject for Andy Warhol. And Nixon was really pissed. And he beat McGovern. And so every year from 1973 on, Andy was audited by the IRS. And so then Pat's job became asking Andy what he did the day before and the night before. And that was the genesis of the Andy Warhol diaries. I think one of the great things about Andy is that he revived sort of dead art forms, like the portrait. No painter in his right mind would have painted a portrait in the 60s. It just wasn't done. but Andy painted portraits, and he made a lot of money doing it. He supported the whole business, supported all the films doing it. The films didn't make any money, but doing it again. That portrait actually was sort of inspired by Ben Shah's portrait of Barry Goldwater, who was the original Donald Trump, in terms of numbers, perhaps. It said, there was a portrait of Goldwater, and it said, "Vote Johnson." And so that was Andy's kind of last involvement with politics, like directly, because he hated, being audited. But Pat was really good at it, and when she did his expenses, Andy became one of the world's biggest tippers. Went to the Odeon, taxi, $35. I mean, they must have gone to the airport on the way to the Odeon. But it was, print for Andy was a way of expressing his real deepest, closely held hatreds. I don't know, how many people have read the diaries? Anybody here? Well, they're pretty juicy. I think you're missing out on a lot, because people were shocked that Andy would say these things about him. His best friend, Bianca Jagger, sued him in London, or in England, because they have a sort of looser libel, slander, or whatever laws there. Because it turned out that Andy had a mean streak that we didn't see, because he was the nicest person in the world, he'd see something hideous and say, "Oh, it's so great. How did you do that? Oh, it's really good. I wish I could do that." Actually, there's a very good piece of art now that you can buy that looks almost exactly like Nixon, and it's Donald Trump, and it was done as an homage by Deborah Cass, who's a great New York artist. You might know her as the woman who did a sculpture on the river between Brooklyn and Manhattan from Manhattan, it says, "Yo." From Brooklyn, it says, "Oi." Anyway. Yeah. Andy's diary, November 3rd, 1983. That's when the IRS got interested in me. There's I guess it's a one of a kind here that I'd never seen before. It's a series of lips. I don't know, like 100 lips. It's a little book. It's just red lips. And I think that was Andy imitating another one of his surrogates, Bridget Berlin. Bridget was one of Andy's best friends. And she was in a lot of the early movies. She was the 300-pound woman with no clothes on, injecting herself with methamphetamine and doing it to others too. You want a poke? Her name was actually Berlin, but people called her Bridget Poke because she tended to give people an unsolicited poke of amphetamines. Anyway, so they talked every night, and Bridget was maybe the one who introduced the Polaroid camera, and she was instrumental in Andy's pioneering of the cassette recorder. And every night they would call each other up and talk for hours. And those they still exist, but the Warhol Museum unfortunately hasn't transferred them to digital. And so who knows how much longer they're going to last. But Bridget has an identical set of tapes and an identical set of Polaroids to a lot of Andy's stuff. And is that a Trump thing? The other great book that, the first commercial, no, it wasn't commercial, it was artistic. The Index book, that was, I looked it up today, it's $14,000 now. I think it was $6 when it was published in 1969. And it was like the first sort of book inspired by Marshall McLuhan, where it's like you open it up and like some paper cutout comes up to greet you, or there's a balloon, or there's a Velvet Underground record. And that was like one of Andy's art books. He did a lot of art. Actually, his first books were art books from his period as a commercial artist. He did many, many book covers from, people from Ronald Furbank to Tennessee Williams. But through that, he got to meet a lot of book editors and designers or art directors from book companies. And so he started doing his what he would do as an illustration as a book, like a cat book, a boy book. And interestingly, his collaborator in this was his mother, who was also the one who introduced Andy apparently to Campbell's soup. But it's a lot of what people think of as Andy Warhol's cursive, his hand, was Mrs. Warhol, who was probably paid minimum wage for her efforts. I was just knocked out by that show. The album covers were really great. I was paid $100 to pose for Andy for the Sticky Fingers cover. The Rolling Stones were always hanging around. And Paul Morrissey would say, "Can you get they're drug addicts. Can't we get them out of here?" But they thought Mick was okay because he didn't seem too strung out. So Andy photographed me, Joe D'Alessandro, Joe's brother, who was Andy's chauffeur, Corey Tippin, who was a hairdresser, about 10 people. And there was always a controversy over who is it. And I knew the inside was me because I was the only one, probably in New York City, wearing Munsingwear briefs. And also it had my distinctive happy trail. Anyway, so that was done in the first interview office, which was a little room. The factory was on the 6th floor. This was on the 10th floor. And we were in an office next to some big architect. It was a very strange building. Saul Steinberg was also in the building. And the US Communist Party was actually in that building for a while. So I was standing there with my jeans down around my ankles. And these guys walked in with like plans under their arms. Is this the architect's office? Next door. Then the Velvet Underground guys, like Lou and John Cale were always coming around. And I think my favorites of Andy's album covers are the John Cale records. My friend Michael Zilk is here. He produced a lot of John Cale's records, and he really brought out I think Andy must have had a big crush on John Cale. In the diaries, there's something that says, John Cale, no, it was Paul Morrissey, but John Cale, $10 for H. No one was very discreet in those days. So interview. I was actually the editor basically 3 times. All of them ended badly, but I enjoyed every minute. Paul Morrissey tried to fire me for a nude photograph of Peggy Moffat and Rudy Gernreich's topless bathing suit, or well, partially nude. And so Andy said, "Oh, Paul, you can't fire Glenn. And all your pictures are just so dirty." But we had to keep it clean with Paul around. See, I don't believe in preparing. I'm much better unprepared. I'm doing it again. One of Andy's best books, I think, is the Amy Vanderbilt etiquette book. And Andy was surprisingly a pretty religious practitioner of etiquette. And I think his heart was really in those books and magazine ads, and he liked those jobs. I mean, we were talking about my career, and my career has a lot of jobs that are not signed, and Andy was the same, although the way he got his name was he was originally signing his work Andy Warhol, and it was a misprint. The credit was Andy Warhol. And he said, "Oh, I like that better." So his name turned out to be a commercial art mistake, and he stuck with it. And Andy was really someone who had a finger in every pie, and he was familiar with what was going on in dance and fine art. I was amazed the day. He had tastes in art that were unexpected, like Armand. I'm having a moment of stupidity. Who's the German artist? Luftwaffe. No. Felt. Think Felt. Boys, yeah. So, the day boys came up to the factory, and it was the biggest mutual admiration society I'd ever seen. And Andy was a very sort of politically incorrect artist. I mean, his big critics were all Marxists and stuff, and they were like, "Oh, I'm your biggest fan." No, I'm your biggest fan. So his literacy, and he read every review, and he would get revenge one way or another. Didn't matter how long it took, he would get revenge. And that's another thing I learned from Andy. My second time at Interview, I was asked to be editor-in-chief of Interview, and it was being sold because the Warhol Foundation couldn't own a profit-making company. So I was asked to be the editor of Interview again. And I was actually the creative director at Barney's and for some of the Calvin Klein brands at the time, and I was making money for the first time in my life. I mean, like real money. And so I said, "No, but I have a friend. I'll go work with her, and it'll be great." And so we worked together for a few months, and then I would hear, she was on the phone, and she said, "Is Glenn okay?" Did he sound drunk? So I left that situation, and 17 years later, I became editor again, taking the place of the person who had set me up. I love talking about revenge. It's like such a dirty subject, but I think, I mean, for me, and I know for Andy, it's always been a heartwarming motivation. And the whole thing about serving cold is good. I mean, frozen is ideal. Let's see. Andy Warhol, print. Magazines. He loved magazines. We always had every magazine at the factory, and we had many, many, many scrapbooks. And every word that mentioned Andy, the factory, any of the superstars, it all went into a scrapbook. And Andy spent a good part of every day reading the scrapbook. And then he would say, "Oh, that Rex Reed is so awful. Isn't he awful, Glenn?" Yeah. And then, you know, to his face, of course, it was like, "Rex." But there were no books at the factory. There were only opera records and magazines. Andy loved being in fashion magazines. He loved being in Vogue, and he admired Rolling Stone, although I think he didn't care too much for the ownership. He liked. You'd find him reading Red Book. You think, why is Andy reading a Red Book or Modern Bride? But he would read any magazine at all, and you know, any gossip column. I think I should take questions now because I'm losing my voice. Is that okay?